It's time for the November reading wrap up. I am recording this the first week of December and trying to rush it out so that it'll be a little bit late, but not too late. I've been really caught up in my Plated Prisoners project I'm working on, and hopefully you'll bear with me while I try to get back into weekly uploads and go back to my planned content schedule. And I think you guys will also see a little bit of that in my November reading wrap up because I really stuck to like some more cozy, fluffy kind of reads versus some of the more serious literary things I've been doing. But let's just get into going over all the books, starting with my 2-star reads. Heat and Deceit by Rory Miles. This is part of the Omega Love series, and I've got to tell you, the books never get as good as book number 2, Party Girl, was. I do think they strive to do a bunch of like hurt, comfort, misunderstanding, coming together kind of scenarios, and I do think Rory Miles sort of strives to like therapy, modern understanding of working through trauma, being patient, and really helping the character who's struggling. This particular character, Nova, has gone through something seriously traumatic. They went through the Omega pairing process, had an original pack. That pack, for whatever reasons, decided they didn't want this girl, trafficked her into forced fed her drugs and forced her to do sex work. So all that is a lot of trauma all heaped on top of each other. And we don't really get to see her dealing with that or processing it. And we don't really get to see how this works in the world. Is a situation with Nova where her and her pack hook up and then they decide to like throw her away common? What does the Omega Council and the Alpha Council do when this kind of situation rises? This is probably the one and only time I would have liked more Omega Council. Usually in these Omega love stories I'm like,
but why does the Omega Council even care?
In this case, they specifically paired this girl up and then the Alphas decided they didn't want her, and instead of returning her to the council, they sold her off over here. Even if we had gotten it in the last third because like she had been recovered in secret and then was hiding as a beta, they would have found out at the end when she came out as an Omega again and was all packed up with these new group. The Omega Council should have stepped in and then be like,
oh, we didn't know about this and this is awful and we're starting proceedings against these other people.
Which is not what happens. First of all, I think it was way too much trauma for Rory Miles to tackle well. Second of all, the whole like,
I'm pretending to be a beta, but these people over here are my pack,
was not as engaging as I feel like it could have been. And then third and finally, the one and only time I would have wanted more world building and more about this council and the way this world works and what happens when things don't go as they claim. All that was just super frustrating. Next is Not Forever by Evil and Flood. I think this had an interesting-ish premise where our main character girl was kind of like dating this one alpha pack. Something bad happened. She goes back to her family and her family, for whatever reasons, wants her to go back to them, so they try to like force her hand. Another unrelated alpha pack swoops in and saves her and takes them back to her place or whatever. You think what you're gonna get are like these two packs kind of like vying for this girl's attention, and there's not enough pushing to steal her back, number one, but number two, this pack over here that it's like sort of established they're not interested in an Omega right now, they immediately go into insta-lust, insta-desire for this girl, which I know is often a trope in like alpha-omega dynamics in these stories. It would have been way better if these alphas were just trying to bring her back to a sense of normalcy, a sense of like comfort in herself. They start to realize that they really care about her, and that dynamic goes from like a helping hand into like, oh, maybe this is forever. But since that's not what happened, and I felt that the execution was just really choppy and abrupt, it was obvious they were all going to get together and have like a happily ever after without us ever going through a good strong catharsis. I just sort of like ended up shoulder shrugging this one and moving on with my life. And last is going to be Glint by Reagan Kennedy. I usually don't talk about early reads in these wrap-ups, but I'm going to in this case. This is my third time reading these books and I have some notes that are not going to fit into my Plated Prisoners series that I wanted to bring up, and this is my video so I can do what I want. Glint is a book that I think I originally put on my shelf for 5 stars, so bringing it down here on the third read to 2 is a huge shakeup. I've always been a little bit on the fence about the Oren Slade relationship, and every single time I've read these books I've liked Slade less and less. But in this particular reread, I just fucking hate Slade and think the only thing worse than him in the book is Midas. But like, Midas is supposed to be a villain, so I can't be mad about that. Also, Glint is super freaking slow. Like in Guild, I know that people complain about it being meandering and not really going places and being just so unpalatable to read, which we'll talk about when we get to that book. But at least the span of time in that book is like over a month long. Glint all happens in like a couple of weeks. It's so slow. Also, one of the things I like about the Play Prisoner series as a whole is Oren's like healing journey. Even though this is part of that turn into the healing journey, it just has a lot of stumbling blocks and a lot of things that like rereading it the third time I felt like were not really helpful and like messed Oren up, and that she sort of had to sort through in book 3. Additionally, in all of the Plated Prisoner series, everyone is super misogynistic, all the girls like kind of fight each other, and everyone's pretty much a terrible person except for Oren, which feels very unnatural, especially in a third reread of these books. I was willing to give them grace about the Saddles in book 1 because like the Saddles are in their own little group, Oren's separated over here in like a literal cage on her own, and the only person they have in common is King Midas, who has reason to like make the Saddles hate Oren and vice versa. Them not getting along and hating each other kind of makes a little bit of sense. Do not understand how they're traveling across the Barrens. Oren is interceding for guards, and she's stepping up and trying to make sure the Saddles are taken care of and trying to protect them and trying to work with them and all this other stuff. And the Saddles still hate her and refuse to acknowledge her this whole time. That doesn't make sense, like from a basic survival standpoint, let alone like how the human brain works. This should have been a turning point where we built a relationship with other people and we just don't. This is probably a hot take, but Jed and Osric should just be one character. And Lou should do more than she's doing, because right now she's getting a lot of grace just by being the one and only female warrior. And don't even get me started on Manila. It really ends up coming off in this third read that Raven Kennedy just kind of like hates everybody. Her brain is stuck in like a hyper misogynistic world, but like even her writing about the other strong female characters in the book like reinforce the misogyny happening in the world around her. And it's most evident here in the second book, which is why it's down here at 2 stars, moving into 3 stars. The Slow Time Between Stars by John Scalzi. I won't go too far into this because this is part of the Far Reaches book and I'm going to have a separate video on that, but this is probably the least favorite. I want to emphasize that it was really an excellent book, very well written, a concept that was perfectly fleshed out and done in a way that was normal and as I expected it. The issue for me was that I have seen this story done many times before. The ship itself is just like building out and taking its time and letting everything unfold as it deems best, like with this patience that humans don't have. But here's the thing, humans do not have that kind of patience. So when you pace it like that, it can be very frustrating for a reader. I think if you've never read like a ship becoming sentient or self-sufficient in this kind of way, this is an excellent intro to that. I was just a little bit bored and over it. Next is going to be Falling Bodies by Rebecca Roanhorse. This is also part of the Far Reaches series. The story itself is again solidly constructed and actually makes me really excited to read more from Rebecca Roanhorse. I have a couple of books of hers on my TBR and they are higher up in the list based off of this one. But this specific story, compared to others in the series, was hard to read. And I think like it was also trying to give you a couple different thematic elements, tonal elements, and they end up getting a little bit muddied and confused and not 100% working. Because of that, I've got it here at 3 stars, even though there's a lot that's really enjoyable. This is one of the more captivating narratives within the Far Reaches collection. Next is going to be Harley by Belle Harper. This story needed more world building. It's a great like overall angsty kind of story. There's quite a few characters I kind of glommed onto and wanted an arc from, and unfortunately this is a Why Choose Alpha Omega story. It's only 300 pages long and there's like 4, maybe 5 love interests. I can't even remember them all. That's how badly they were fleshed out. And this is one of the reasons Why Choose stories are often 400, 500 pages, because when you have so many different people with so many different arcs, there's just a lot to navigate. They just keep throwing issues at this like pack structure that they're trying to build. First, they've got to like actually win this girl in the lottery, so we have to rig the lottery so that actually works out. And then on top of that, one of their pack members is turning feral, which is a bad thing, and then another one of their pack members is mute, and both of those like disqualify them from ever entering in any lotteries ever. But if this girl doesn't actually end up with this pack, the one guy who's going feral is going to complete that process and be kicked out of society forever and probably kill themselves and tear a bunch of people apart. So that's all like a lot of stake, right? And we got to make that happen. They're sus because people can tell the lottery was rigged. So now we've got this lady coming in and out of their house while she's trying to like build relationships with first the guy who's going feral, so he's a little unpredictable, and the mute guy who has some self-esteem issues, and I think there's two others, and then there's like a beta that she likes that's in that pack, and another beta that's like far away that she wants to come into the pack, and that's like a whole lot of stuff happening. Plus, she's eventually gonna go into her heat, and then she's not gonna have any kind of like reasonable anything going on anymore. It's just gonna be steamy part of the story. Oh, and also the larger community is feisty with the way that their world is set up, and they're like rioting and rebelling. And because of that, it's dangerous for this chick to go outside, and it's dangerous every time one of these guys goes outside to get stuff. And maybe they're not safe where they are, and maybe they have to go someplace else before her heat hits because they'll all be very vulnerable then. And you see how like 300 pages is just not enough to wrap all this in. Gleam by Raven Kennedy. This is the third book in the Plated Prisoners series. When I originally read it, I think I said it was the best of all the Plated Prisoners so far. Maybe it's like the second best of all of them so far. If you're reading Plated Prisoners because you wanted a fantasy romance, I think book 3 is where you'll finally get that payoff. And because of that, like that long slow burn that's taking you a couple thousand pages to get to, it might be very rewarding for a lot of readers. For me, I actually found that super frustrating in this particular reread because of how much I hated Slade coming out of Glint. And every time Orin was like,
I'm gonna leave without either of them,
I was like,
yes, please. Let's rewrite this book right now, girl. I'm down. Both these guys are toxic, gross messes.
we do not need all of the continuing reveals, both for Midas and Slade. Leave all of that behind and disappear into the wilderness. The end scene of Gleam is just epic, and there's no way to get around how good that is. It might even be teetering into 4 stars, but I think because I'm so anti-Slade at this point in time, it's stuck here at 3. And that rolls me into Glow by Raven Kennedy. This is book 4 in the Plated Prisoner series, and if the romance started up with Slade in book 3, it gets hot and heavy here in book 4. So all romance readers, yay for you. I'm glad you're finally having a good time in what was supposed to be a fantasy romance the whole series. For my project, this was the most important book and where I was pulling the most chunks out and taking the most notes for this video. You guys will hopefully see soonish. And I enjoyed my read a lot more this time around than I did the first time, partially because I wasn't like super impatient to get to the story and figure out what was going on. I still hate the Ozric Riza dynamic. It's gross. I am still epically disappointed in what they did with Manila, and also like very disappointed in where Queen Calla goes too. There's tons of reveals on top of themselves, and how Orin like held herself during this like propaganda campaign was just not executed super well. And I think a lot of authors are really into like this Game of Thrones style narration, story, dark, gritty epicness sort of thing, and are not executing it very well. Raven Kennedy is a really good writer. I enjoy her prose. I think she does a great job making like some interesting character dynamics, telling some unique fantasy elements and fairy tale fable kind of things, as well as like twisting the story in ways that are unexpected by readers. But I don't think she does this Game of Thrones part very well, imagining characters' ambitions and goals, and then actually giving them plans and plots that make sense to go with those things. It's so cardboard, cut by the numbers, boring. It's so clear that none of these characters have any idea what they're doing or why they're doing it. It means that there's not a lot of stakes or tension for me because it's just gonna go whatever way the plot needs it to go for things to happen. Moving into 4 stars. The Long Game by Anne Leslie. This story was so cute and personable and fun. I loved it. I think it is really good. I think it's even better if you're actually reading the Far Reaches collection in order and you get to this one right after the last Alien one that we did, because it's a fun turnabout between the two. I think this one also leaves you like on a hopeful note for like sentience and doing better for society and coming together and becoming like a strong, capable, independent group. groups. Granted, like, humans are not portrayed very well in this, and I sort of feel like this story is the kind of story I would have wanted to see instead of Avatar. Next will be Void by Veronica Roth. This is also part of the Far Reaches story, and I really enjoyed it. Engaging, pulpy, fun kind of thing. Best part about it is like the science fiction world building and the actual mystery and characters themselves were a little blah, but that's kind of what you expect from Veronica Roth. And to be fair, I didn't even think she could world build well, so this was like a bunch of steps up in my estimation of her as a writer. Still think she has a lot she needs to work on, but now I know she can make a fun, cogent story, and that's a lot more than I knew before I started this. Not That Serious by Lana Cole. This book is part of the Omega Sweets verse, and this is actually a lot higher than I usually give Lana Cole's contributions to the Sweet verse. And in all honesty, it's probably a little bit closer to 3 than 4 stars. This is much better than Lana Cole's usual entries are, and I had a lot of fun, and my mind needed a break, and I read this at the right time to be getting that kind of floofy little break. All that said, while I laughed about the general premise and the interactions between different characters, I did have a little bit of a problem with the premise. There's a national shortage of heat suppressants, and because of that, she has to do her first heat, ends up hooking up with her best friend and forming a pack around that, becoming best friends to lovers, forming the pack. All of that was a lot of fun and really sweet and cute, but the whole, like, this started from a shortage of medicine and the idea that, like, a national shortage of medicine could be good, or how some people might compare the heat suppressants to birth control, even though in this universe birth control is an entirely separate thing that she has covered, did concern me some. I felt like there were a couple of problems that we weren't really fully exploring there, a couple of elements that kept pulling me out of like this fluffy fantasy, fun, good, campy times, and into like some real world drama that maybe I just really could have done without. Not From Around Here by Violet Coulter. This is a 4 stars for premise when it's really like a low 3, high 2 in execution. I really enjoyed the idea that this is like a normal girl from our universe who manages to like cross over worlds into like an Alpha Omega brand universe, and she becomes like an Omega and has to kind of navigate that. Some of the things I loved about it is in our world, our protagonist is working 2 jobs, there's 60+ hour minimum wage, she has a deadbeat boyfriend at home who doesn't give a crap about her, and then she goes into this other world, and while she has to struggle with becoming an Omega and some of like the traditional role elements and some unfairnesses she's perceiving are like bad treatment, even the worst treated person in this world has a place to live, has health care, and is generally treated with respect. And I like having those 2 things held up, because a lot of times people would say like an Alpha Omega universe is about like traditional women's roles and people like quote unquote preferring the traditional thing over the modern day thing. And that's not necessarily true, because this character does push back against a lot of traditional roles or traditional elements that people try to push on her as an Omega. But what she does really appreciate, what she needed even to sort of like find herself and find her own happiness, was enough physical security to explore some other opportunities. And I also really enjoyed the chance to have like normal girl from our world thrust into this other world where all these other social norms are accepted and expected from her, and her kind of reacting real time like,
What? That's really weird, or that's off-putting, or I don't want to do that.
the same way a lot of people do when they hear about the Alpha Omega verse. I just sort of got like a little chuckle about that too. And then like as far as the actual relationship goes and the steamy scenes and all that, it's just not that good. There's not a lot of tension in the relationship. The dynamic there doesn't feel quite as organic or motivating as it should. There's a 3rd act breakup that wasn't really necessary, and there's this will she return to her old world moment. 100% did not need to be there, and was really very like wedged in just because we wanted a 3-act structure. And last is going to be Guild by Raven Kennedy. When I first read this book, I put it in the top 10 reads of 2020. When I reread it, I still rated it highly, and even here in the 3rd reread, I think it holds up really well. Now granted, the world of the Plated Prisoners is highly misogynistic. This book opens with an orgy. It dabbles in sex work, and it's non-consensual sex work. There's a brutal and graphic rape abuse scene. Our main character gets beat up a lot. It often feels meandering and struggling because our character doesn't really know what's going on, what her place is and everything. She's using alcohol as a coping mechanism. She's all over the place. I think it is fantasy before it's romance, and I really enjoyed a lot of the fantasy elements. Like the world world building parts, taking over this mystery and investigation, and using the things that Oren has on hand to try and figure it out and figure out what she's supposed to do. The best part about it is in the back third, after that brutal assault, Oren touches that person and turns them solid gold. And I just think that's like such an epic and fun reveal. I know a lot of booktubers didn't realize when they read that part in the book that what this means is that Oren is the person with the gold power. She isn't gold touched. Midas is the person who's been using her on multiple levels, including for her powers. There is no Midas without Oren. All that, like, for me, snapped immediately into place and made sense. And maybe part of this is like the fantasy girly in me, just knowing how these things play out, and the fact that people, you know, bought Reese's thing where she'd stolen some of Midas's power or had been like accidentally gifted it. We haven't heard of that happening ever anywhere in the story, but for some reason a lot of people were going with that. Like, yeah, it just speaks to how easy it is to dismiss some people when they're presenting a certain way. And in this case, people were sort of underselling Oren and dismissing her, even when the story is told from first person, even when they're the readers and they're not immersed in this world. I think that makes this even stronger, makes it an even better and more exciting reveal. I do not think it's for the people who are here for the romance portion, and that makes it really rough because this is a romantasy that starts straight fantasy and probably what I would consider like a dark fantasy. And lastly, sitting at 5 stars, How It Unfolds by James S.A. Corey. This is part of the Far Reaches collection. I really loved it. I thought it was compact. It gave us a couple different perspectives. It was doing a lot in a little bit of time. And it just generally showcases Corey as an excellent writer. Very entertaining read. Had a lot of food for thought in like the science fiction, but also in the human element. And all of it like really wove together well and helped like elevate each individual part. And lastly, it's going to be Just Out of Jupiter's Reach by Nnedi Okorafor. I first read something by Nnedi Okorafor in the Black Stars, and I gave it like 3-ish stars because for me, it just was a little confusing. This story is not confusing at all. It's deeply engaging. It's really good. I think it's showcasing why people love Nnedi Okorafor in such a wonderful way. I love this story, the characters, the imagery, where it was going, kind of the looseness of how it was told that sort of leaves you wondering like exactly what the point is all the way till we get to the end. And we realize like it was the human element, it was the deep character study this whole time. But I really enjoyed all of the characters. I enjoyed their thoughts, their feelings, the way it manifested in their ships versus what they were saying. I just think the whole thing is beautiful and that Nnedi Okorafor is a great storyteller and you can really see it in this outing. But overall, I had a pretty cozy November. I hope you guys had a great Thanksgiving if you're here in America and are gearing up for your great winter holiday, whatever that is for you. I hope you tell me in those comments down below what your favorite read was this November. And if you got this far in this video, leave me like a fall leaf emoji. And as always, keep reading. Bye!